How do you put something back together if you don't know about all of the pieces? This is the story of my search for pieces in the puzzle of how my 300-year-old house evolved into what it is today. With a poor state of this section of the house, 1714. Why is that? But when I look carefully, I realize this exact spot. 1913, only on this side. Good work. I've had to look really carefully, think about, and then often just guess. In my last two videos, I discovered this wall and the piece of newspaper under the floor tiles. But these are just the latest in a series of discoveries that I have made about the house. All of which have helped me piece together the history of the house and how it has developed since 1714. In renovating or restoring a house, it's inevitable that some things will be lost in the process. So when I start work on this section of the house, that process of losing clues to the past will continue. So I want to show you some of those clues now, especially as they might help you make sense of some of the work that I'll be doing. When I first saw the house, two of the things that confused me the most were the poor state of this section of the house and the position of that shed behind me. But a good place to start an explanation is actually at the back of the house. For a long time, this back wall was covered in render. But one thing that you could see if you look very carefully was the difference between these two windows. From their size, shape, and the grills in front, they appeared to be pretty similar. But if you look carefully, you could see that one window had stone lintels and the other one didn't. Without the render, that difference is obviously a little easier to see. Now, the reasons for that might have been that the openings were created at different times, or perhaps it was because the different parts of the wall were built at different times. And now, without the render on the wall, you can actually see a line that runs up through the middle of the wall. And this line might explain why there is a small cornerstone in the middle of the wall, and then above, a much bigger stone that seems to be bridging a gap. Now I head inside to look for some more evidence of this. First of all, we'll head upstairs. And we'll take a closer look at this wall and consider why it appears to be in so much worse condition than the other internal walls in the house. On this side of the wall, one reason for this part looking so untidy is this old integrated drain pipe and a whole series of bricks which seem to have been used to fill up some void. And I'm pretty sure that they wouldn't have built a drain on the inside of the house, which definitely suggests to me that this was once an exterior wall. And then back on this side, this wall appears to have two separate layers of stones. A smoother section above, and then below, a layer that looks like it might have been added later. And perhaps this lower layer of stones was used to frame what would have been a new door opening, or perhaps it was to hold up a new ceiling that was put on. And what about this wall on the ground floor below? Here I am back in the dungeon room, where the base of this wall is made up of bedrock, which doesn't happen in any of the other walls in the house. And you've got to ask the question, why is that? And then in this room, this section of the wall has been blackened out, almost certainly by an old fireplace. It's really clear to see the difference between this black part of the wall and the cleaner part below. But there is no evidence of any sort of chimney, either here or in the wall above. And my guess is that when this wall became an internal wall rather than an exterior wall, they took away all evidence of the chimney and probably at that time installed the vaults for the first time. Based upon those various clues, I'm fairly confident that the original house was only on this side and that everything on this side was added in later. So what else might have been in place when the house was first built? I know from a series of old aerial photos that this shed was built in the early 1980s. But from a series of even older aerial photos, I know that there had been an even older version of the shed on this exact footprint. Because this is probably the best viewing point in the whole property, I do like spending time up here, but it is a bit of an eyesore. And I used to wonder why it had been built in this position, at this height, and at this angle. And I believe the answer lies in this wall section below, which when I first saw the house was partially hidden because the earth was at a much higher level. And rather than this wall being constructed as a shed wall, it was actually here before, and the shed was built into it. And from here you can see from the angle and direction of the top of the wall that it points towards the corner point of the original house. And as you can see in this photo, it used to be even clearer when there was more wall between the shed and the house. In fact, before the extension was added, I think the wall would have gone right up to the edge of the house. On the evidence of these old steps that I uncovered, it's pretty clear that there was always a very steep rise from this point up to the house. And at this point in the wall, there used to be a doorway that was even clearer from the other side. And it used to be well below the level of the main front door. So on this side of the wall, there must have been steps of some sort to get up to the front door. And perhaps the wall that I found here last week used to be part of those steps. So if this part of the house was a later extension, when was it added, and was it all added at the same time? In my earlier house tour video, I showed a photo of some structures that used to be in front of this part of the house. But from this line of cornerstones up this wall, I think the original extension would only have come up to this part here. And then over here, there is similar evidence of a line of cornerstones. So I think an initial extension was just in this part and stopped on that line there. I'm not sure when it was built, but perhaps it was during renovation work in 1860. But I am sure that these shutters would only have been added after the work was completely finished. And these shutters have the year 1913 pinned into their design, so the extension was definitely built before that date. We'll now have a look at some of the clues that are inside the extension. But before we go in, I'll pause here to show another aspect of how this area has changed over time. I've spent a long time looking for old photos of the house, and an archive in Girona suggested that they had some. They had photos of a school trip to the church in the 1940s, but when I first saw this photo, I didn't recognise the view. But then I did recognise a couple of patterns on the wall, and I realised the photo was a mirror image, and that it was actually taken from this exact spot. But that the windows looked different, and there had once been trees in this area. I also didn't initially recognise the view in this next shot because of the trees and the angles of the buildings. But when I looked carefully, I realised it actually was the house. although I've removed some of the walls and moved some earth that you can see in this second photo. And the donkey shed to the left is long gone. Now I will head inside and look at some of those clues about the extension. Here are the shutters that I show you from the other side, and from the depth of this wall, I'm pretty sure that this must have been intended to be an external wall and the end of the initial extension. And then on this wall, there's actually a second opening in here that had been filled in, which you can see a bit more clearly from the other side, where the frame of the second opening is made up of these very thin brick tiles. It seems a bit strange that they should have two doors right next to each other, but my guess is that this one was an old doorway to what was once the outside, and that when they created an extra extension space here, they decided that this doorway either wasn't big enough or wasn't in the right place, and that they opened up a new one here. Although it's not easy to show on camera, this wall is a lot thinner than the wall through there. And I think it's yet more evidence that this whole section would have been added in at a later date, probably at some stage after 1913. Another aspect of this area to note as a reference for later on is that the floor level here is a good 3 or 4 steps lower than when you come into the front door. I'll now head back outside to talk about some of the structures that I mentioned had been added to the other side of that wall. When I bought the house, there had been a buttress against the wall there and a sort of open porch in that section, and there was a balcony on top. And above the balcony, the upper part of the wall was about as mixed up and as untidy as it is now. But in this old photo that I showed you earlier, this section looked quite different because there was clearly once a room on top of those structures that had been added at some stage and then subsequently taken down. And in some other old aerial photos that are a bit blurred, you can still make out quite clearly that there were even more structures in front of this area here. And sure enough, when I excavated some of the earth from here, I found the walls of what was probably another shed. So it's clear that this whole area has seen a dramatic number of changes over the years, with lots of walls, windows, doorways and chimneys having been added in, removed and then filled in. So when you know the history of this section, it's not that surprising that it looks in such a terrible state. But all of this information is really important for my renovation work, especially for my architect when they considered what foundations were going to be needed on the inside and on the outside. And after I did the research into this part of the building, to help with the renovation planning work, I put together some graphics to show how I thought the house had evolved over time. I've added a recent aerial photo to the front of the sequence to help position the graphics, and then they progress from the 1700s to 2020. I know a bit more about a few things since I made these graphics, but I think the overall sequence is still just about right. Other important information for the renovation work relates to the walls and structures that were down in this area. I think these were all constructed in the early 1900s, and the majority of them relate to draining and storing rainwater and were connected to the brick drains that I uncovered in a recent video. I've now removed most of the structures that were here, but one thing that I still need to do something about is here, which when I bought the house, the front was all bricked up and above was a tiled box. But under here is an old water well that was carved out of the bedrock below and is about 12 meters deep and about 1.5 meters in diameter. There's no water in the well now, but I would like to be able to use its cavity, but it's probably going to be safer just to cover it up properly and seal it off. By standing here, you get a pretty good idea of the drop in front of the house, and in the past, over here, there was an even clearer indication of how the heights change. because behind the huge amount of earth that I added into this area is a 3-meter breeze block retaining wall that was put in about 50 years ago to ensure that there was no slippage of the slope on the other side of it. There was also another much lower breeze block wall here that I took out that used to run from the corner of the shed there to the retaining wall there. Before it was added about 30 years ago, there had actually been a much older and deeper stone wall on that exact line. And some of that old wall still remains today, going from down there to up here, so probably just under 2 meters. And a slightly lower section of it remains at this end as well, here, where it's actually got some pretty substantial old cornerstones built into it. And when you know that this was an old stone wall, it gives you a much better idea as to how the shed ended up in this position with the particular angle and shape that it has. And with the wall stretching across this entire space, probably from when the house was first built, it would have enabled a flat space to have been created on the slope that would have been perfect for a walled garden. So whether it was the walled garden, the retaining wall, the rainwater structures, or even the shed, this area has seen dramatic changes over the years, and the height of the land has changed a number of times. And the wall that I found here last week fits into that storyline of there being a number of changes over a number of years. And as I said earlier, I'm sure there must have been some steps from the front door down to the tiled area there, and also some further steps that would have gone down to where there was the old doorway much lower down in the old wall that connected to the shed. But my current guess is that when the extension was made, they needed to make changes to all of the stepped area here. Perhaps because they wanted to have an opening from the extension into this space, but they needed to deal with the fact that the floor on the other side of this wall was a lot lower. So I'm guessing that they would have changed the steps that were here, lowered the ground level here, and then built this wall lined up with the edge of this doorway. And as for the hole on the other side of the wall, I will have to dig it out to have a better idea of what it was for. But at the moment, I'm thinking it probably was for a flower bed or for a patch of herbs, as suggested in the comments of the last video by C. Ferguson 3368. Good work. A lot of the other material that I removed from the surface here last week were probably added in the last 60 to 70 years. And in that period, there were a couple of key people and developments. First of all, after the last rector left in 1959, the house was actually lived in for 10 years by a Dutchman called Wouter Gotta. Apparently there was some local mystery about this person, but I managed to track down one of his nephews on the internet, and he told me a bit about his uncle and how he had started a new life in Spain in the 1950s. Wouter died here in 1969 and was buried in the church, and other than that, I don't know much about the man, but I suspect that he might have been responsible for some of the colours inside the house and some of the ceramic tile decorations that used to be dotted around outside. Since Wouter died in 1969, the house has been uninhabited, but for many years it was looked after very well by the same family that supported the church. So thank you very much again to them. They and others have been able to tell me some things about the history of the house. But for the most part, to solve the puzzle of how this house has evolved over the years, I've had to do a lot of research. I've had to look really carefully, think about, and then often just guess what has happened and why things were as they were. One thing that I do know is that in the coming weeks and months, as I progress the work on the house, there will doubtless be plenty more surprises. And on a final note, if there are any other parts of the house that you would like to know more about now, please do ask in the comments below, and I'll try to give you an answer either as a reply or in a future video.